Welcome to Althea and Kimberly's Tips on Writing a Literature Review. We decided to collaborate on this video since we both have excellent things to offer to the writing process that we want to share with you after having read and graded a number of these assignments.
Yes, and as we've been discussing, writing and research are collaborative projects, and so it makes sense for us to come together, collaborate, offer our different insights, and then model that for you all.
Pool our strengths,
Yes.
just like you all are doing.
Okay, you've already spent a significant amount of time finding and combing the relevant literature on your topic, evaluating the information that you found, and identifying major themes. So now we turn to the hardest part, possibly, is the writing. We want to ensure that you're able to keep your review focused, but recognize the broad appeal and impact of the research that you've been doing. All of the evidence that you've gathered and that you will use should speak to your research question. And though it may be necessary to provide some contextual information, remember that the purpose of your literature review is, simply put, to address your specific question as completely as possible in a logical structure. So we're here to offer you some tips on how to do that.
So first, what are you contributing with your literature review? This is an increasingly important genre of writing as the production of scientific research increases. With an abundance of primary research, it's just not possible for practitioners to examine in detail every new article that's published, although of course, folks do their best, as will you, from henceforth. So it's often necessary and very useful to be able to refer to summaries and analyses for synthesized insights. So your literature review is one of these pieces of writing. You're filling a very real knowledge gap. So your work may be used by practitioners when they're making decisions about practice and care. That's why it's incredibly important that you accurately represent the literature that you found. There's a couple of ways that we want to suggest of doing that. You want to build authority in your writing, draw conclusions based on your research without overstating the findings. This is really tricky. And you need to be culturally sensitive in your writing because you may be writing about populations that are not your own, or you may be generalizing about populations that are your own. Either way, it's tough to navigate. You want to do it with care.
Yeah. So how can students speak with authority? How much authority should we be writing with and speaking with?
Here's the kind of tension that I think about with that. You want to speak with enough authority that your audience, the reader, thinks you're worth paying attention to. If you're too kind of self-deprecating in your writing, the reader will think, well, why should I pay attention to this? What's important about this thing? But I think if you overstate your authority, especially on something that's well known within the field or is controversial, you could quickly lose credibility with your author, or with your audience, excuse me. So I think you really need to kind of walk a fine line with that. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Althea. I'd also just add that you've been doing a ton of reading on your topic, so it's very likely, and I would hope certain, that you have found some of those foundational ideas and concepts, interventions, therapies, etc., on your topic. So it's very common that you would have seen the same work or works cited throughout the articles that you've been reading and thinking about, and the more often an article is cited and used authoritatively, the more confident you can feel that that's going to be a conclusion that you can rely on. That's going to be a piece of evidence that you can feel pretty confident with saying, this is what this is.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that I would just say, and we're going to get into this in a minute, that citations like those that you're kind of paying attention to and noticing in your reading that are coming up over and over again, that's one way that you know to rely on that piece of writing. You see those citations, right? And so, okay, I think Kimberly's going to talk next about the role of citations in building authority.
Oh, joy! So, yes, your citations show that you are building your work on the authority of others, right? You are contributing something really important, but you're not doing that in a vacuum. You are recognizing the contributions of others in this area and in this field, and then you're going beyond that. So don't feel scared or hesitant to cite profusely. I have had students tell me, but it's ugly when I have to put in a bunch of in-text citations. But that's the way that we are able to speak with authority and recognize that these ideas aren't necessarily our own, right? We need to give credit to the folks who did that original work. And also keep in mind that your audience, whoever's reading your writing, might want to go and learn more. So by having that citation right there in text, we can be sure that if folks have questions or want to know more, they know exactly where to go to find information on your topic. So think about all of the articles that you've read this quarter. There are often in-text citations in almost every sentence. Sometimes sentences have multiple citations in them, and that's to be expected. As you're thinking about the sources that you're citing, I'd also encourage you to be as current as possible. There are those seminal and foundational works that are older and are incredibly important and should be cited, but we want to ensure that with the rapid progression of publishing, we're basing our conclusions on literature that is up to date. You don't want to identify a gap in the research if there really isn't one there, and you've just maybe missed a pocket of articles that would have addressed an aspect of your topic. So if one of your sources is a little bit older, again, that can be perfectly fine. But again, if you're looking for things on therapeutic interventions, treatments, things like that, you want to stay, I always suggest, within the past 5 years. If there's really nothing, you can expand that out. Definitely don't go past 10 years, right? But if you have some older articles, one thing that you might do to see if there's anything more recent is something we've done in class before, right? That citation chaining, where we're searching not only the bibliography of the article that we've already read, but then forward chaining to see who's cited that article, because it's very likely they'll be talking about a similar topic, if not in exactly the same way. That might be another way for you to recognize, okay, here's what's been happening more recently. Right. And the other thing that I'd like to add, another way to build authority, is not to include simple summaries of your articles that you found. The abstract kind of does it. So we're not looking for a summary, we're looking for an analysis of how the findings of the different articles speak to not only your research question, but to each other, or in some cases contradict each other. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Ooh, how to draw conclusions based on your research without overstating the findings. So that's something that you're going to need to do, like Kimberly was just saying, by identifying disagreements in the literature, and there often are some. You know, sometimes it looks as if something's changing in the literature, but there hasn't yet been enough studies to prove that definitively. That's all important to kind of identify in your writing, and that's a way of also kind of hedging your bets a little bit. You know, where you're indicating to the reader, I know that this is just what we know right now, or the extent of our knowledge right now, or the extent of my knowledge as a writer at this point. So we've been learning about this quarter. You need to not simply summarize the literature that you found, but discuss it critically. Identify and name methodological problems, point out research gaps and limitations, and always to take care not to make broad sweeping statements about the conclusiveness of results. This is especially important when you're writing about a culture that is not your own, and when we know that there is already a lot of bias in the literature. The literature review should read like a critical evaluation of the sources on your topic, highlighting and comparing results from key sources. Consensus or differences should be noted in your review. Inconsistencies and contradictions should be addressed, as should the strengths and weaknesses of the body of literature as a whole. So I know that some of you have already identified this, that there is just a lack of research on a particular topic. And that's something that's worth noting, that you're doing the best that you can with the research that's been conducted, but that hasn't been adequately researched to make firm conclusions yet. Remember that readers might go to look at the full text of one of your sources if they have questions or if they want to know more. So again, be sure that you're accurately representing the articles you've read, because I know we will often check things like that, and so will your readers, which is appropriate. And stay concise, since you're providing citation if they want to know more. This is something that's kind of nice about how many citations end up in your paper. You know that as long as you're saying something that's really in that paper, you can say it succinctly, and if a reader wants more information on it, they can go and read the article themselves.
Agreed. So we come to the biggie, right? Which is how to be culturally sensitive when talking about a culture that is not your own or could be your own, but you're making, you're possibly making generalizations, or you're thinking beyond your own individual experience.
I don't know that we have any tips about this. Maybe more like thoughts and cautions about it. Yeah, I think one thing that I talk to my students about is being as specific as possible in writing. So if you are talking about a certain subsection of a group, really naming that and not overgeneralizing about the whole group based on a small intersecting set of identities or even just a small part of that group.
Yes, exactly. I think that it's incredibly important as we're finding research from different parts of the country, from different nations and people, that we're thoughtful about what is the same and what might be different. What I mean by that is, if you're looking at research on a specific group in the Northeast of the United States, there can definitely be some commonalities, but you also want to identify and point out that this is within a specific context, right? A geographical context, a possible, what do I want to say
Cultural
here?
Cultural
or political context. And that can be different than looking at that same, people of that same ethnicity or nation of origin, even on the West Coast, right? So we want to be thinking about, okay, are the systems that are in place the same across these locations? If not, how can I identify that and make that known and recognize that as a possible limitation, right? I don't think that it ever weakens a paper to identify those limitations. It can only make it stronger.
And the specificity.
Yes, in the specificity.
Yeah, totally. I would say another thing, I don't know if you agree with me, but I think using the language that using the terminology that a group of people prefer for themselves is really important. And if that differs from the way that that group is talked about in the medical literature or in the profession, you can bridge that as a writer by saying, often referred to this way, the preferred language within the group is this. I know some students have included tables with terminology within their paper to enable that. Naming, I think, is very powerful and can be very violent, and so acknowledging the power of that language, I think, is really important.
That's an incredibly relevant and powerful point, Althea. I definitely agree with what you've said, and that kind of brings me to, if we turn our attention quickly to the screen, right, in the methods section, this is a place that you might think about identifying that,
good point.
right?
Yeah.
Because the language that we use through our, from our tools, our databases and things like that, can be problematic. And so even though we have to replicate the search that we actually use, right, and replicate that language, it can be a useful thing to identify what Althea just said, which is, here's the language that I was forced to use, right? Here's the preferred language.
So you're kind of saying that could even be a couple of sentences in that section where you could say these searches represent language that's used in the literature, but the preferred terms currently are, and you could kind of name that.
I think that would be appropriate.
I love that idea. Yeah. I think that's great.
Okay. Anything else that we'd like to add?
Yes. One last thing. Yeah, I think I would encourage you all, to the best of your abilities, to think about power dynamics when you're talking about groups of people, especially when we're talking about like access to care or the frequency with which people seek out medical care or the reasons why they might not. Just think about where groups are placed within our society, what things are working against us, who holds the power in a particular situation, and be thoughtful about that in your writing. I'm not thinking of a good example right now, and luckily I think the paper that we're going to be looking at doesn't run into problems with that. But I can think about drafts of papers for this project that I've read where there's kind of subtle blaming language for like non-access and things like that I would just caution you to be really thoughtful about in your writing.
Agreed.
Okay, we're at the end.
So now we'd like to move into looking at an example of a successful paper that was written by a student in a previous quarter in this class, and we want to talk about what was strong in this paper and also areas for improvement. Yeah. Okay. So you'll notice many of the same sections, or almost all of the same sections, that you'll be creating for your literature review, including an abstract, the research question, purpose of this research, an introduction, and methods.
Something that I think is great is that this paper, within the body section of the paper, they've organized it by kind of subsections that I'm guessing came from their synthesis matrix.
It did.
Yeah, so I think that's really great because that's part of the logical organization of the paper that Kimberly talked about. There can be actually lots of logical organizations, but what you want to do is give indicators to the reader of kind of where you're going and how things are grouped together. So subheadings are a great way of achieving that.
Yes. Fantastic. Agreed. One thing that I'll note up here that isn't highlighted right now, but articles that were chosen represented populations of patients that were described as, right? Chinese, and then it goes on to detail the language that was used in those articles. That's incredibly important because rather than just saying, right, Chinese, because we have folks from different backgrounds that are represented within that Chinese and Chinese American, and rather than just saying Asian, right, which someone might have used to include Chinese American, Samoan, Filipino, like all of these things, right, but isn't actually detailed enough to give folks an indication of what's relevant to a specific population.
So that's an example of that specificity of language, to be culturally sensitive. So we highlighted this section of the paper, I think because it was a good example of pulling together lots of different sources from sentence to sentence that kind of built a context together. So a way of integrating sources. So this one reads, the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IIRIRA, and the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, PRWORA, have made immigrants of any documentation status more vulnerable to deportation, resulting in fear of deportation itself, manifesting as a barrier to health care. And then there's a citation for Joseph, 2017. Not even provisions from the 2010 Affordable Care Act, which only expanded the cut to cover adult U.S. citizens, long-term legal permanent residents, LPR, and temporary protected status, TPS, immigrants under Medicaid expansion, have helped ease the struggle to access health care for immigrants. And now that's a new source that's coming from, CAPS and FIX, 2013. Medicaid expansion was decided by each individual state and did not require a specific policy to be adopted, allowing each state to decline many coverages and conditions that are necessary for immigrants to have access to health care. And here's now a third source, U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, 2018. So what I love here is that the writer built a full kind of picture, very briefly, of some important context for understanding the rest of the paper, using 3 different sources, but in this way that felt very seamless and all made sense together.
Yes. Agreed. As they continue writing, we have an example of drawing conclusions here without necessarily overstating, right, those findings. So they've listed this contextual information and then go on to include information about health complications, access to health insurance and health care, and they sort of sum it up, right? including another source here, but also finding kind of a logical, not endpoint, but logical conclusion, right, from all of the information that's listed above to result in, as a result, immigrants make up 30% of the uninsured population in the U.S., Bustamante and van der Wees, 2012.
And we liked this in particular because it had a phrase that we kind of noted in different places in this paper, signal phrases and synthesis phrases that are helping to introduce or conclude or synthesize literature. So as a result is one of those phrases that you yourselves can use in your paper.
Yes. All right, as we continue down, we have another example. Well, we have an example of introducing an author's work and doing that at the beginning of the sentence rather than at the end of that sentence. And also we have another nice signal phrase, right? According to. So you're recognizing where you're getting the information from without having to provide a whole bunch of extra information, right? So this is who I got the information from. If they're interested in more information, they can find that in your bibliography or your works cited, and then jump to that source.
This is another example of that. I think that's why we chose this. In a study conducted by, so that's just like according to, right? It just indicates this is where we're getting the information from. It's also an example like the one previous of a citation at the beginning of a sentence rather than at the end. And then this follows additionally, and then this is a new author. So in a study conducted by Fisher, Cervantes, Fink, and Kutner, and then the next sentence is additionally, Mechnikov et al., right? So that's two ways of introducing literature in two subsequent sentences.
Yeah. One thing that you'll note is throughout this paper and the papers that you have been reading yourself this quarter, we don't need to include the full title of the article that you've read. It takes up valuable space, and readers can find that information in the bibliography. So really just using the author or authors' last names is sufficient. And here we just have another example, I believe, of, you said this so nicely, Althea.
Another way of integrating a source, I think, with an introductory phrase. This one's more specific, a little less generic. It begins to state what the article or what the author said, and then introduces the author's names and kind of goes on with the conclusion. It's nice to have, we provided you with some templates for phrases to use in your paper, but it's also nice to have a variety of them in there. So we're just pointing out kind of different ways that authors do this, so it's not like according to.
Okay. Yes. All right. Here we have an example of an in-text citation, and we want to remember that when we include the citation, we need to have quotation marks, and we also need to include the page number that came from. You'll actually notice that a little bit later on in this paper that isn't always what's done. So even in a really strong paper, there can still be room for improvement. We highlighted this section because we thought the writers did a really good job of identifying the communities that were studied, right? And ensuring that they were attributing the results of that study only to the communities that were studied.
And also in not overstating the generalizability of that, because it says it was noted that some.
Exactly.
I think we chose this last one because it can be hard to know how much detail to get into when you're stating something in your paper that's important for the reader to know, but maybe isn't the main kind of meat of what you're saying. So this was an example of mentioning some important stuff very concisely and then giving the citation like always, so that someone can go and read more. So this says, other methods for indirect communication mentioned include integrating questions about advanced care planning into check-in paperwork, initiating a conversation by using another person's experience as an example, and then there's 2 more examples about that, and it ends with a citation. So that's a way of dealing with, you're going to be synthesizing so much information from so many different sources. It's going to be really hard to pick how much detail to go into and still stay within the page lengths. This is just a good example of that.
Yes. All right. So in the discussion section, we actually chose to highlight this because we found it important that the writers were recognizing the bias that crept in to their writing, as well as the bias that was in the articles that they found. But I also would say that I would have liked to see a little more detail about this in the discussion. So we here have several types of bias from authors of reviewed studies, as well as the authors of this study pose as limitations, but it would be really helpful to know what were those biases so that the reader can make a decision about whether those biases will impact how much authority to grant the writers of this paper and the papers that they're citing.
I mean, we know that almost every study has bias, right? But the more transparent you are about naming that bias, the better equipped your reader is in, like Kimberly said, evaluating where that bias may have crept in, right? And where you may want to give a little more consideration to certain conclusions, things like that.
Here we have an example where there should be a page number, right? We have the beginning of a citation, and then we have a direct quote, but we don't have the page number here. So, yeah.
Always room for improvement.
Always room for improvement. And at the end of the paper, we have the synthesis matrix. And at the very end, we have, scroll, we have our citations. And so this, like you all are doing, was an updated synthesis matrix to include any sources that you didn't include in that first version of it. And so yeah, it's been updated with all of the sources that are listed here.
And we've heard from Ethnomed that readers find that really useful because sometimes people are looking for a collection of articles to dig into more deeply. They don't even necessarily need to read the synthesis. They want to read the primary articles, but they don't have to search for them all like you all did this quarter.
Yes, you've done the work for other folks, and isn't that wonderful, a wonderful contribution? Yeah.
Should we move on to some more tips for writing?
I think we should.
To conclude this little lecture.
Okay.
So now we have just some last kind of thoughts and tips that make writing easier, that make editing easier. You want to start?
Okay. Once you've written, have someone who is unfamiliar with your topic read your paper. Even if they don't necessarily understand the entire methods section, right? They'll be able to give you a good idea of flow, right? How clearly you explain things and how clear connections are within your paper.
I think that's the most important thing is it's so hard to see where you've made kind of a leap in your thinking without kind of naming it, and someone who's unfamiliar will immediately detect that.
It's like, what's going on here?
One of my favorite writing tips, and I know it's hard because we're also rushed in our process, but is to give yourself at least a day between writing and trying to edit your paper. Something that I have found, I know this is how likely is this to even be followed, but something that I have found is when I've just written a paper and I go back to edit it, I read what I think I wrote, not what I actually wrote, because it was all there in my mind, and I'm just my brain's just putting it right there on the page, even when it is not actually typed there. When I give myself a night to sleep and read it over the next day, it's much easier to detect those issues and errors.
Yeah, I think that leads really nicely to the next tip, which is to read your work aloud.
Yes.
Your brain is going to make those connections, but oftentimes your tongue will not. So you're going to hear where, I forgot to put an and there, or have two ands there. So let some of your other senses do a little bit of work for you and help you out.
It's a really good tip. The last tip that I have is to also write out loud. I know this is a little counterintuitive, but this is a great way of getting over writer's block. Sometimes there's a disconnect that happens between our brain and our typing hands, where it's like in there, it's rolling around, but you just can't get yourself to write it. If you have a recording device on your phone or on your computer, it can be helpful to just start talking out your ideas and then transcribe them. So then type them up while listening back to them. Because sometimes we're able to speak our ideas more kind of fluidly than we're able to type them. It's a good way to kind of get started when you're struggling to do that.
Definitely. And my last tip is around citations, the bane of everyone's existence. I always have students tell me, they definitely don't want to plagiarize, but they feel like they're citing too much. And what I'll say now is what I said at the beginning of this, which is you are building your work using other people's work. So if you did not come up with that idea on your own, or it's not something that you can reasonably expect, and that's even kind of tricky, right? The rule is common knowledge, but that's not, things aren't always common. So if you're worried about it, cite it.
I agree.
Yeah.
Cite.
After you write. Get loopy here.
That's clearly the end of this lecture. Write well, and good luck.
Good luck. I'm so looking forward to reading what you produce. I'm sure it will be wonderful and impactful.
I agree.